Good evening and greetings. I'm your host, Dr. Wolfula, and when I'm not performing taxidermy on dead birds, one of whom is my mother, I'm here at the Wolfula reviewing movies. In this video, I'll be covering the original Psycho, directed by Alfred Hitchcock and released in 1960. Oh, and also the Gus Van Sant remake from the 90s, just because it's basically the same fucking movie.
Well, a boy's best friend is his mother.
A boy's best friend's his mother.
But let's start with the classic. Turn on the black and white filter. Psycho isn't the master of suspense's best movie. That honor is reserved for Juno and the Paycock. But Psycho is easily one of, if not the most widely known of Hitchcock's films, and one of the most influential horror films ever made. Before he made Psycho, though, Hitchcock had nearly 40 years of filmmaking experience under his extremely wide belt, and was one of a rare few directors of his time who was as famous as the actors he cast in his films, thanks to the success of his iconic anthology TV series Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Everybody knows that profile.
There isn't a chance I'll be recognized.
So after Hitch made one of his biggest and greatest films ever, the classic North by Northwest, the director decided to follow it up with a low-budget exploitation film. Psycho is based on Robert Bloch's novel of the same name published in 1959. The novel is often considered to be inspired by the Ed Gein case, but according to Bloch, the novel's subject matter was only coincidentally similar to Gein's crimes. Bloch lived 35 miles away from Gein's town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, and when the writer became aware of Gein's arrest, Bloch inserted a reference to Gein in the mostly finished manuscript for Psycho, but later Bloch was amazed by how similar twice murderer Ed Gein's story was to the fictional tale of Psycho. Specifically, Gein had a domineering mother and wore women's clothing, supposedly pretending to be his mother when she passed. But Gein also dug up graves, made furniture out of human flesh and bones, and supposedly had the intention of making a woman's suit out of human skin so he could fully immerse himself in the role of his dead mother. These myriad aspects influencing Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Silence of the Lambs.
You know what Ed Gein said about women? One part of me wants to take her out and talk to her.
And what the other part of him think?
What her head would look like on a stick.
Now, there was an Alfred Hitchcock biopic starring Anthony Hopkins that really emphasized Ed Gein's influence on Psycho, but the real Alfred Hitchcock always downplayed Ed Gein's association with Psycho.
My mother always said, if you want to do a job, do it right.
Before Hitchcock was involved, Psycho was already looked at by Paramount for a film adaptation, but it was considered too taboo in its subject matter to film. When Hitch's trusted assistant, Peggy Robertson, brought the novel Psycho to his attention, Alf bought the rights to the book himself for nearly 10 grand, and, as the legend goes, he bought every available copy of Psycho so few could know the story of his film adaptation beforehand.
Psycho is going to be my next movie, and I don't want anyone to know the ending till they see it in the theater.
Hitchcock's desire to not only direct a horror film, but one based on a book so offbeat from his usual material was out of a need to stay fresh and break from his usual mold as a filmmaker, so it would be harder for younger competing directors to imitate him.
But what if someone really good made a horror picture?
Paramount refused to bankroll an adaptation of Psycho, though, especially at the kind of budgets Hitch was used to in the multi-million-dollar range. So Hitchcock suggested that Psycho be a low-budget film instead, made for under $1 million, shot in black and white film and using crew from his TV show. But Paramount wouldn't even go for a cheap Hitchcock film. Hitchcock only had one film left under contract with Paramount, and he had already moved his office to Universal at this point. Paramount could see where the winds were blowing and wouldn't want their last Hitchcock film to be a low-rent exploitation flick if they could help it. So Hitchcock decided to just bankroll the budget of Psycho himself out of his own pocket, and Paramount would only have to pay for its release in theaters and the marketing. Paramount didn't even have any stage space available to rent for Psycho, though, so Hitchcock shot it at Universal instead. Ironically, even though Paramount distributed Psycho, Hitchcock and Paramount eventually sold all the rights to Psycho to Universal in 1968. And today, Psycho is commonly believed to be a Universal film, especially given that the Psycho house is the crown jewel set of Universal's backlot tour. But Psycho kinda technically is more of a Universal movie than a Paramount movie, since it was actually shot at Universal. Universal just didn't release it in theaters originally. Psycho's screenplay was drafted by a then inexperienced screenwriter by the name of Joseph Stefano, who drew from experiences in therapy describing his troubled upbringing with his own mother.
It boggles my brain just trying to imagine what on earth you and your shrink could possibly talk about every day.
My mother?
And Stefano's script was mostly faithful to the story of the original novel, while taking some liberties with the story, mostly to accommodate the retooled characters of the film's two stars, Janet Leigh and Anthony Perkins, who signed on to the low-budget production for smaller than their usual salaries out of an eagerness to work with Alfred Hitchcock. People who weren't so eager to work with Hitchcock were the censors. In 1960, there still wasn't a proper rating system in place in the USA, so a mainstream movie was either approved for content or just wasn't.
We're denying your seal.
Which meant you were under the mercy of censors that limited how much violence and sex you could get away with. And Psycho pushed the boundaries in both regards, featuring things never seen before, particularly a partially unclothed, unmarried couple sharing a bed. You couldn't show that before. It wasn't proper. And you definitely couldn't show a woman in her bra before. Women in intimate moments up to this point were just shown in nightgowns in films, and a shower scene, even from the shoulders up? Forget about it. Psycho loosened things up a lot, making way for the fun stuff movies could get away with in the next decade, and just as a crazy example of how uptight things were, Psycho was the first mainstream movie to show a toilet flushing. You couldn't show that in a movie either. It's insane to think about. When Psycho was released, it was met with middling reviews because of its William Castle-like marketing gimmick that wasn't so much a gimmick as it was a mandate. Nobody could be allowed into a showing of Psycho once it began. If you arrived late, you had to wait for another viewing because Hitchcock realized the disappearance of a key character halfway into the film would confuse viewers who arrived late. But Hitchcock was a showman and realized that this rule would also be a fantastic way to market Psycho, announcing ahead of time that the movie had a crazy twist and creating a sense of urgency for audiences to see the film before it was spoiled for them. Because Hitchcock wanted to preserve secrecy surrounding the movie, he was the only one allowed to promote the film in interviews.
Your new film is called Psycho. Can you tell me something about
In
it?
some sense, it could be called a horror film, but the horror only comes to you after you've seen it, when you get home, in the dark.
The stars couldn't discuss the film in the media themselves, and instead of a conventional trailer, Psycho's movie trailer was a 6-minute tour of the film's sets, hosted by Hitch himself, vaguely describing scenes from the movie.
This picture has great significance because, let's go along to cabin number 1.
Humorously hyping up the crazy shit you'd see in the film without actually saying or showing what happens.
It's difficult to describe the way that the twisting of the
It's even Vera Miles in the shower scene instead of Janet Leigh. You'd have to watch the movie yourself to find out what really goes down. Not like today. Now you can just watch some dipshit movie critic on YouTube who can tell you everything that happens in a movie, and speaking of dipshit movie critics like me, well, Hitchcock's strict mandates to preserve the secrecy surrounding Psycho also extended to how the film was screened for critics, in that it wasn't screened for critics at all. Typically, films are screened ahead of time for the purposes of promoting a movie, but critics weren't allowed to see Psycho until release day, and they had to go to a regular theater showing with average filmgoers, which screenwriter Joseph Stefano believes led to some critics bashing the film, who had been used to getting special treatment, and there was some general backlash towards Hitchcock doing something different from his usual thrillers on a significantly lower budget. That said, audiences ate up Psycho, and it became Hitch's biggest hit at the box office ever. Adjusted for inflation, it made $500 million in 2023 money. Psycho's mainstream success and its reputation with the public over the years led to it not only being reevaluated as one of Hitchcock's finest films, but also one of the most influential movies of all time. And I'll break down why in my review of Psycho. But first, I have a message from my sponsor, me. Pledge to my Patreon today to support the channel, help it continue to grow, and you'll also get access to weekly movie nights every Sunday and archive commentaries if you miss the movie nights live. Just $5 a month to get a movie night every week. Pledge to patreon.com/Dr. Wolfula if you're interested, and I thank you in advance. Before getting into the plot of Psycho, I have to talk about the film's iconic intro. The intro was designed by famed graphic designer Saul Bass over a frantically paced score composed by Bernard Herrmann. The titles and credits of the film converging and splitting, subtly representing the dual nature of the movie. Two stories converging, and the dual personalities of one character and the duplicity of another. There are two sides to the story of Psycho, and neither the characters or the audiences gets the full story until it comes together in the very end, which is artfully represented in the credits sequence. The credits also serve to get across to the audience that this is a horror film early on, because there are no overt scares until about 50 minutes into the flick. Psycho is a film about two people. Janet Leigh's Marion Crane, a real estate secretary based in Phoenix, Arizona.
Mr. Lowry, if you don't mind, I'd like to go right on home after the bank.
And Norman Bates, the proprietor of a motel that carries his name near Fairvale, California.
There's no sense dwelling on our losses. We just keep on lighting the lights and following the formalities.
The early scenes of the film chiefly concern Marion, whose name was Mary in the book, but apparently there was a real woman named Mary Crane who lived in Phoenix, so I guess they were afraid of getting sued and changed the name of their heroine to Marion. Weird. Marion's role was expanded from the novel, where she was only featured for a couple of chapters, but in the film, she's featured in nearly half of the story to take advantage of Janet Leigh's appearance and give you a dramatic hook in the plot using a sympathetic character you take a journey with and get to know.
Oh, Sam, I hate having to be with you in a place like this.
Marion is romantically involved with Sam Loomis, and yes, Donald Pleasance's more famous character from Halloween is named after Psycho's Loomis. Halloween is an elaborate homage to Hitchcock, so a few characters in Halloween are just straight up named after characters from Hitchcock films.
Pardon me, I'm Loomis, Dr. Sam Loomis.
Anyway, Sam's and Marion's long-distance relationship is struggling due to Sam's financial problems. He works at a hardware store, he has crippling debt handed down to him from his dead dad, and he has to make alimony payments to his bitch ex-wife.
I sweat to pay my ex-wife alimony, and she's living on the other side of the world somewhere.
All these issues have prevented Sam from committing to Marion. Oh god, I am a real piece of shit. Hey, there's an Alfred Hitchcock cameo. And hey, that's Alfred Hitchcock's Nepo daughter.
Teddy was furious when he found out I'd taken tranquilizers.
Fortunately for Marion, fortune smiles upon her in the form of a fortune. A businessman by the name of Tom Cassidy, I think I know a guy named Cassidy, well, he's gifting his daughter and future son-in-law a brand new house, and is depositing $40,000 in cash at Marion's office over the weekend. Just so you know, in today's money, 40 grand is nearly $500,000. And he's just fucking carrying it around.
I never carry more than I can afford to lose.
Marion's boss is uncomfortable keeping so much cash in his office's safe, so Marion is tasked with depositing it directly at the bank. Except she doesn't. On a whim, Marion pockets the cash and goes on an impromptu trip to her beau Sam, planning to start a new life with him with a stolen fortune. Marion's plan is totally stupid, of course. The decision is made out of desperation and love, but she realizes the holes in it throughout the drive to her BF's hometown of Fairvale, California.
I'll get it back, and if any of it's missing, I'll replace it with her fine, soft flesh.
Marion's obviously not a professional thief, so her interactions with a cop and a car salesman are met with instantaneous suspicion that only grows the more suspicious she acts.
Is anything wrong?
Am I acting as if there's something wrong?
Frankly, yes.
Stammering over her words, very poorly lying and acting like she's on the run from the law before her crime has even been reported.
It looks fine. How much would it be with my car?
It's the first time the customer ever high-pressured the salesman.
Marion's 15-minute road trip is a guilt trip held up by Janet Leigh's frenzied reactions, thinking about the consequences of her actions, scored to perfection by Bernard Herrmann.
She looked like a wrong one to you?
Acted like one.
Totally embracing the cliche, his music is the heartbeat of the film, really selling the sense of urgency, Marion's rushed panic. Herrmann opted for a strings-only score to accompany Psycho instead of utilizing a full symphony because he believed the black and white visuals of the film should have a stark, intense score to back it up. The irony of Psycho's opening is that it's all about Marion trying to avoid getting caught for a crime, but it really would have been in her best interest if she was arrested before she reached the Bates Motel. Norman Bates, the proprietor of the motel, played by Anthony Perkins, is a departure from his book counterpart, who was described as a short, stocky, slow-witted, bald man.
I've had my difficulties.
Hitchcock wanted to go in a different direction with Norman and casted somebody an audience can easily sympathize with in the form of Anthony Perkins, whose boyish appearance makes him look like a 6-foot-tall 10-year-old.
Just tap on the wall. I'll be in the office.
Thank you, Mr. Bates.
Norman takes a liking to Marion, checking her out as he checks her in. But Norman's overbearing mother, Norma, in the main house, wouldn't approve of him cavorting with a floozy like Marion.
Oh, tell her she'll not be appeasing her ugly appetite with my food.
At first, Norman seems like a nice, normal, affable guy who has a good sense of humor about running a motel in the middle of nowhere.
Stationery with Bates Motel printed on it in case you want to make your friends back home feel envious.
On the surface, he seems harmless. Nowadays, we've had a lot of villains since who put up a friendly facade, but Norman Bates' portrayal in Psycho was innovative. Audiences at the time wouldn't expect the boy next door to have a darker side, which comes out when discussions turn to Norman's dear old mother.
Wouldn't it be better if you put her someplace?
You mean an institution?
To a modern viewer, nothing about Psycho is shocking, but it's only because this film opened the door for all the shocking things that have been witnessed on the screen since, be they subtle or more obvious. When Norman, against his mother's wishes, invites Marion for a wonderful sandwich and milk dinner in the stuffed bird room every home has, it becomes clear that Norman and Marion are two sides of the same coin. They're both in their own personal traps, with little hope of getting out of them.
We're all in our private traps, and none of us can ever get out.
Norman's trap is obvious. Like a Discord mod, he has no life. All he does is spend his days tending to Mother in a motel with no guests, plus some bird taxidermy here and there. Hey, he stuffs birds and Marion's last name is Crane. Because of Norman's mother's psychological torture and manipulation, Norman has no hope of ever leaving his home because he's been convinced his whole life that he can never find success or love anywhere else.
Why don't you go away?
I couldn't do that. Who'd look after her?
Norman's experiences stuck for so long in his own trap opens Marion's eyes to the trap she's caught herself in, stealing the $40,000, and she tries to find a way out of it before it's too late. When I need to think through some things, though, I take a nice long shower. Ah, yeah, that's what I'm talking about, Janet. Clean those shoulders. Hell yeah. What the? Ah! The shower murder scene carried out by Norman's jealous mother is easily the most iconic moment in Psycho, and probably the most famous murder scene in all of cinema. It's a very simple killing on paper, literally. In the book, Mary's just decapitated.
It was the knife that, a moment later, cut off her scream and her head.
But Hitchcock realized he was limited in what he could get away with on film at the time, but still needed to shock people. So Marion is simply stabbed, and you don't even see the knife piercing her skin, but what makes the killing is how vividly realized it is. There are around 60 cuts in the editing sense during this sequence, shown from various angles. Saul Bass meticulously storyboarded the scene so Hitchcock could have a clear plan of how the murder would play out, and it took about a week to shoot what is essentially a minute of footage seen on screen. Movies around this time generally didn't have a lot of quick cutting, and paired with Bernard Herrmann's iconic score, the murder is not only an assault on Marion, but an assault on the senses of audiences at the time. Even though the movie shows no stabbing or clear nudity, audiences were convinced in 1960 that they saw more than the film actually showed.
I distinctly saw both the stabbing and the nudity.
They saw Janet Leigh's nipples and a knife entering her when all that was merely vividly suggested with some fast edits, unnerving music, and some chocolate syrup. Making me hungry. Marion Crane is definitively killed halfway through the events of Psycho. Peak shock value for the time. The headlining star of the movie you've built up to sympathize with is brutally killed, and her corpse is dumped with her car in a swamp. Of course, the death of the first character you meet in a horror movie has since been frequently imitated in the years since, so it isn't shocking anymore. Mary's death in the book happens very quickly. You don't get to spend a lot of time with her before she's gone, but Hitchcock intuitively understood that by waiting a little longer and with the right casting, he could shock audiences and draw them into what the story of Psycho really was. The story of Norman Bates.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
And Hitchcock also understood going into this adaptation of Psycho that in order to get audiences engaged with Norman's story, he had to be likable and sympathetic, not the porn-addicted drunk he is in the book. Norman's an innocent Boy Scout who has suffered abuse by his mother. You don't want to see him take the fall for his mom's insidious crimes. It's like when Marion steals the money to begin with. It wasn't her fault. It was things outside her control that forced her to make a hasty decision for somebody she loves. Norman's forced to unconvincingly lie to stay out of trouble in place of Marion.
Said that nobody had been here for a couple of weeks, and there's a couple came by and didn't even know that you were open.
Yeah.
Now, Norman isn't really technically the protagonist of Psycho. He's where our sympathies lie, but really the protagonists of Psycho are Vera Miles as Lila Crane, the sister of Marion, teaming up with Sam Loomis to uncover what happened to the missing gal in their lives.
Your sister's missing how long?
She left Phoenix a week ago yesterday without a trace.
Lila and Sam are the heroes of Psycho who have to solve the mystery, but their roles are downplayed from the book in favor of focusing more on Norman, the more interesting character in the story. There was even a love story between Lila and Sam in the book that got cut out of the movie, which is messed up considering Marion hasn't been gone very long. But the movie sequel does end up revealing that the two do get married. Good for them, I guess.
Stay here.
Why can't I go with you?
I don't know.
The interesting thing about Psycho's mystery narrative from this point forward is that it's all about dramatic irony, at least seemingly. None of the characters has a full picture of the story until the very end of the film. Lila and Sam don't know Marion is dead. They just think she's hiding from the feds, and Norman might just be in on it.
Now, if this Marion Crane were here, you wouldn't be hiding her, would you?
No.
And Norman doesn't know his mother killed a woman who's wanted for grand theft, making his hotel the target of a private detective named Arbogast, though Norman's mother makes short work of the private dick. That last step is a doozy. Lila and Sam only serve one purpose for the sake of the audience, finding out what's the deal with Norman's mother.
Put me down.
The sheriff reveals that Norman's mom committed suicide with her lover years ago.
Norman Bates's mother has been dead and buried in the past 10 years.
But who's the woman in the Bates house? Who has been berating Norman? Who's been killing people? And why hasn't Hitchcock been showing Norma's face this whole time? It's clear that Psycho has a final twist, and it might be obvious now since so many movies since have had twists similar to it, handled in more shocking ways, but an audience in 1960 that hadn't read the book would be unprepared for what Psycho had in store for them.
Suppose you want to room?
Lila and Sam stake out the Bates Motel and find a clue that points to Marion having to have stayed there.
That proves Marion was here. To be too wild to
Bates never denied she was here.
So their scheme is Sam will distract Norman while Marion sneaks in the Bates house to find out what the deal is with old lady Bates. And Lila discovers in the fruit cellar, well, Mrs. Bates is definitely dead. Which is what Lila would be too if Sam wasn't there. So yeah, I'm sure even if you haven't seen Psycho, you're privy to already knowing Norman Bates was masquerading as his mother the entire time. But, and I've been saying this a lot, an audience in 1960 wouldn't have seen this coming.
Norman Bates no longer exists. He only half existed to begin with.
Somebody having dissociative identity disorder would be a foreign concept. People barely have a grasp on mental health problems today. They were gonna have a hard time understanding it in 1960.
He's a transvestite.
Not exactly.
So Hitchcock goes out of his way to provide a psychiatrist who can entertainingly explain Norman's delusions in layman's terms.
So he began to think and speak for her. Give her half his life, so to speak.
Norman's once domineering mother withdrew her affections towards him once she found a new man, and the jealous Norman poisoned his mother and her lover both, but couldn't live with the guilt and loneliness. So Norman created a distinct mother personality for himself that he could switch to give himself company, and Mother would get jealous and kill any women Norman had an interest in. A twist like Norman being his own mother carrying out these killings is easily executed in a book because you don't actually see anything in a book, and you can have an unreliable narrator that tells you it's the quote-unquote mother carrying out the crimes. But with a film where you actually show the audience everything, Hitchcock was faced with the challenge of having to light or frame his shots in such a way where your view of Mother is obscured, but it's not made completely obvious it's really Norman.
He was never all Norman, but he was often only Mother.
A movie today can totally cheat this shit by revealing, no, it was Edward Norton the whole time, and showing all the earlier scenes with just Edward Norton by himself without Brad Pitt.
Because we're the same person.
The shy Norman Bates has fully retreated in the face of all of the scrutiny, with his more forceful, assertive mother taking control of things for the foreseeable future.
Why, she wouldn't even harm a fly.
The original Psycho was a groundbreaking hit that pushed the boundaries of what a film could get away with. Nowadays, it'd carry a G rating. You could probably show it to your kids and they'd be fine, but we have Psycho to thank for helping to liberate cinema from the shackles of morals and family values, allowing us to get away with the crazy violence and dark themes of entertainment today. And even if Psycho doesn't carry the same shock value now, it's still really damn entertaining thanks to its top-notch visuals, score, and performances. I give Psycho a mommy out of mummy. Psycho's influence is felt through nearly every horror film since its release, one of which was the earlier mentioned Halloween in '78, starring Janet Leigh's daughter, who gets to live through the whole movie. And Halloween's success led to the slasher movie trend of the '80s, which also led to a swath of sequels to classic horror films, one of which was Psycho.
Norman Bates is judged, restored to sanity, and is ordered released forthwith.
What about his victims?
Psycho's 3 sequels ranged from really good to, okay, I guess. And after a failed attempt at a Bates Motel TV show, years before a successful attempt at a Bates Motel show, Psycho inevitably got a remake, released in 1998 and directed by Gus Van Sant. In the late 90s, Universal was in a frenzy to create remakes to some of the popular films they owned. Around this time, they were also trying to get remakes off the ground of King Kong, Creature from the Black Lagoon, and The Mummy. The latter, of course, happened in '99, and eventually a King Kong remake happened in the mid-2000s. In '97, though, Gus Van Sant made the Best Picture-nominated Good Will Hunting. It made $250 million. He could make any movie he wanted, but the next movie he directed for whatever reason was a remake to Psycho to some not-so-good results.
Put her in someplace.
To call Gus Van Sant's Psycho a faithful remake would be an understatement. It's a shot-for-shot remake of the original film that just happens to be in color and take place in 1998 instead of 1960. The dialogue in the Psycho remake is almost exactly the same.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
Virtually every shot in the remake is an almost exact recreation of shots from the original film, edited 99% identically. Why is the Psycho remake such a slavish recreation of the original film? Well, apparently Van Sant was a big fan of Psycho and wanted to use the opportunity to remake it as an experiment, shooting a shot-for-shot remake as closely as possible. I can kinda understand the approach to a remake like this. There's a certain level of respect towards a film like Psycho, and you don't want to mess with the movie too much, so making the remake shot-for-shot can be interpreted as putting on a new production of an old play. It's the same script, just with new actors reading the lines.
A hobby's supposed to pass the time, not fill it.
A hobby's supposed to pass your time, not fill it.
That analogy falls apart, of course, when you realize, well, plays are performed live and aren't available forever. Whereas, you can watch an old movie at any time thanks to home video. So if you're remaking something, you ideally have to have something about your remake to set it apart from the original and make it relevant to modern audiences. But the Psycho remake, as a shot-for-shot remake, has little space to add anything that would make it compelling to watch over the original film. Since the Psycho remake is literally the same exact story, all I need to discuss is what actually is different about it compared to the original. Well, the cast is different, of course. Anne Hesh is Marion, Viggo Mortensen is Sam and Sam's ass, Julianne Moore is Lila, William H. Macy is Arbogast, a cameo by Flea for some reason, Ron Howard's dad because this movie was made by Ron Howard's production company, and, of course, Norman Bates is played by, Vince Vaughn, one of the most baffling casting choices of all time.
My hobby is stuffing things.
Vaughn had just come off big success in Swingers, so Universal was hoping to turn him into a box office draw quickly.
Then this 50-cent piece has your name written all over it.
First by placing him in the Jurassic Park sequel, followed by his marquee role as Psycho's titular Psycho, and it just doesn't work. Especially in the context of the kinds of films Vince Vaughn would make and be much more well known for. Vaughn's Norman just comes off as a sleazy, untrustworthy weirdo.
Would you have dinner with me? Kitchen's awful homey.
When he peeps on Marion, they put in the sound of him jacking off in the background. Fucking gross, dude! Vaughn's Norman's just not sympathetic. He dresses either like a porn producer who slips his actresses roofies, or he dresses like The Rock did back in the 90s. It's impossible to give a shit about this version of Norman Bates.
I didn't think the police went looking for people who aren't in any trouble.
Which is amazing, considering it's the same dialogue, the same shot composition. It's just the choices Vaughn makes with his performance and other slight differences makes his Norman the opposite of what Hitchcock intended.
After she left, she didn't come back. Why would she?
Making the second half of the remake fall apart, and the first half wasn't doing so great either.
Well, I almost had an accident last night from sleepiness.
Because this is a version of Psycho in color, Van Sant seems to have chosen to accentuate that by making the film's color palette as garishly brightly saturated as possible. Starting with the bright green of the intro, the movie looks like shit. Part of that does seem to be intentional though, highlighting how much worse the USA looks than the 38 years since the original Psycho. A country in decline, dominated by decaying strip malls without a drop of sincerity to be found.
You mean you don't want the usual day and a half to think it over?
The Bates Motel itself looks like a pay-by-the-hour joint, not a place run by a wholesome mama's boy. And the iconic house from the original film, based on the Hopper painting House by the Railroad, is turned into more of a generic house for the remake. The movie's 90s setting is also offset by the fact that, due to a miscommunication, the costume designer thought the remake was going to take place decades earlier, and they stuck with it. So the whole cast is dressed like it's the 70s, and it just looks tacky. The whole movie looks like a cheap porno version of Psycho.
$400,000 cash.
Making a new version of Psycho in 1998 with the same exact script is ill-advised because what shocked a 1960s audience isn't gonna bat an eye in 1998. To compensate for the public's changing taste in horror while still being faithful to the original film's narrative, the remake squeezes in some more gratuitous content, mainly in the shower scene's outcome, where you can see actual stab wounds in Anne Hesh, and they also thought it was important for us to be able to see the late Anne Hesh's butthole in this shot. Not that I'm complaining. Not only are the killings bloodier, but they also have weird cutaways to non-sequitur subliminal images like naked blindfolded ladies and cows in the rain. I don't know why, I guess to try to throw people off with random shit that definitely wasn't in the original movie, just to have something surprising happen in the new film. And speaking of throwing people off, Danny Elfman did the score for the remake, and it seems like it's supposed to be an experiment in the sense that it's basically the original movie's score, but a lot shittier and less intense. With different parts of the arrangements overlapping with each other, or tracks poorly timed, or put in random, inappropriate places, just to try to disorient viewers familiar with the original movie. I get what they were trying to do with the changes in the remake, but the execution is all just really, really stupid. The only good change from the original Psycho in the remake is that they were finally able to shoot the opening shot the way Alfred Hitchcock intended. There was supposed to be a seamless flying shot into the hotel room in the original Psycho, but the technology wasn't there to make the shot smooth, so they had to do it in cuts. With the remake, though, they were able to actually accomplish something Hitchcock couldn't, so there's that at least. The opening shot of Psycho 1998 is better than the original, sure, but the whole ending of the remake is a lot fucking worse. Vince Vaughn looks goofy dressed as his mom. He looks like he's cosplaying as Farrah Fawcett. And when they get to the expository ending scene, they realize people are already getting up out of their seats and heading out of the theater. So they play the acoustic guitar of that one douchebag every college campus has over the entire closing monologue.
You have to go back 10 years, the time when Norman murdered his mother and her lover.
It sounds like it was mixed on GarageBand. It's just fucking garbage. I have no clue what they were thinking.
He stole her corpse. He hid the body in the fruit cellar.
Psycho 1998 is just a waste of time and money. Unlike the original movie, which was made for about $5 million in 1998 money, the remake was made for $60 million, and it did not make that money back. It was a box office flop and hated by critics. It was a huge embarrassment for Universal that was mostly forgotten, but the Psycho remake is still worth watching for fans of the original film as a curiosity, or for somebody interested in its experimental aspect as a shot-for-shot remake. Seeing some of the different takes on the characters by the actors in the original and remake, the ways the remake does contrast from the original. Still, I don't recommend watching the remake over the original at all. It's just worse in nearly every way.
Why, she wouldn't even harm a fly.
I give Psycho 1998 a Vince Vaughn Norman Bates out of Anthony Perkins Norman Bates.
You eat like a bird.
Before I go, give Goulashes and I's new riff view of Scooby-Doo The Mystery Begins a watch on the Gulag channel today. Link in the description, subscribe to the Gulag channel too. I command it. Finally, now it's time for Doc's fan mail. Ryan K. sent me a charmingly hunched Scooby plush, Lego minifigs of Goulash, and I'm choosing to believe the buff motorcycle cop in the cape is me. The Podmortem Horror Podcast sent me a collection of pins, stickers, and magnets. Give them a follow and listen wherever you get your podcasts. If you have any fan mail to send me, be it a letter, artwork, or a film you'd like to see me review, feel free to send it to my P.O. Box, Dr. Wolfula, P.O. Box 618-305, Orlando, Florida 32861. If you'd rather just send me an email, you can reach me at drwolfulafanmail@gmail.com. This video is made possible through the pledges of my Patreon supporters, and I'd like to give a very special thanks to the kind folks pledged to my shoutouts tier. All of the support on Patreon means a lot to me, and it helps my dark influence continue to grow. If you like this video, like it, and if you loved it, click the subscribe and bell buttons for more vids. Be sure to also keep in touch by following me on social media at Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Dr. Wolfula. While I still have your attention, consider pledging to my Patreon to support the channel and get bonus content like previews, VIP Discord server access, private movie night streams, and credits in videos. Consider pledging at patreon.com/Dr. Wolfula. Also, check out official Dr. Wolfula t-shirts and other merch on tpublic.com/user/Dr. Wolfula. Thanks for watching. See you all next time. Dr. Wolfula signing out.